Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website. We remind everyone in-house that you should turn off your cell phones. And, of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. I will point out that our panelists today have so much interest that we are being watched by our friends in Tyler, Texas, where Roy Maynard, the editorial page editor of the Tyler Morning Telegraph, teaches a debate class in high school on part of this subject and has already sent a question that I have turned over to our host, who will start the questions with that one. Hosting our program here in the room is James Roberts. Mr. Roberts is Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth in our Center for International Trade and Economics. He focuses primarily on the production of Heritage Annual Index of Economic Freedom. He also studies economic and political issues in Latin America and Europe, as well as development assistance and nation-building issues. Before joining us here, he served in the State Department for 25 years with tours of duty at U.S. embassies in Mexico, Portugal, France, Panama, and Haiti. He also helped coordinate several major U.S. assistance programs, including efforts to reform Eastern Europe economies and most recently to reconstruct Iraq. Before entering public service, he was a financial analyst at Ford Motor Company, and he also served in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Jim Roberts. Jim?
Thank you, John. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for coming. Good morning. In the last few years, a number of very smart people have taken a stab at solving age-old problems of underdevelopment and economic growth. We have seen some well-known recent books, Why Nations Fail, I brought them along, Guns, Germs, and Steel, that have made valuable contributions to our understanding. For conservatives, though, those books and many others have not addressed all of the core questions. This book, Poverty of Nations, does. It connects the dots when looking at how to shape the best policies for economic growth and development. As Marvin Olasky put it, Darren Acemoglu and Jared Diamond have described the elephant's trunk or its legs, but Asmus and Grudem are the first to show the whole behemoth. Several books inspired our authors today, including works by Lawrence E. Harrison, and especially The Wealth and Poverty of Nations by Professor David Landis of Harvard, who just died a few months ago. Another book that Drs. Asmus and Grudem cite frequently, I am happy to report, is our own Index of Economic Freedom, which they have gotten free copies of today. Reviews of the Poverty of Nations have been enthusiastic. Pastor Rick Warren says it should be a standard text for missionary training. Hugh Hewitt recommends it as an explanation of how free enterprise and, crucially, biblical teaching combine to illuminate the path to progress for the poor. He urges every legislator and every voter to read it. Father Robert Sirico, the president of the Acton Institute, quips, merely reading its table of contents will provide clearer thinking than many graduate students get in economics courses. Before I turn the podium over to them, a few words about our speakers' backgrounds. Dr. Barry Asmus is a senior economist with the National Center for Policy Analysis. Professor, I hope you won't mind if my reading Ronald Reagan's definition of an economist. Someone who sees something working in practice and wonders if it would work in theory. Frivolity aside, Dr. Asmus has been named by USA Today as one of the 5 most requested speakers in the United States. Over the last 25 years, Dr. Asmus has spoken to thousands of companies and associations throughout the country. He testified before Congress on the U.S. income tax system and was a featured speaker at a Social Security privatization conference of Western European leaders. On recent trips to Romania, Albania, China, and Peru, Dr. Asmus has encouraged government leaders to adopt policies that free the market, lower taxes, protect private property, and liberalize international trade. Dr. Asmus is the author of 9 books. His book, Crossroads, the American Experiment, the Great American Experiment, was nominated for an H.L. Mencken Award. As a professor of economics, he was twice voted University Professor of the Year and was honored with the Freedom Foundation Award at Valley Forge for private enterprise education. He also co-anchored a syndicated radio program called Perspectives on the Economy. Our other speaker this morning is Dr. Wayne Grudem, Professor of Theology and Biblical Studies at Phoenix Seminary in Arizona. He holds an undergraduate degree from Harvard and a Master of Divinity from Westminster Seminary. Dr. Grudem earned his PhD at Cambridge. From 1981 to 2001, he was Professor of Biblical and Systematic Theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. Dr. Grudem is co-founder and board member of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, a past president of the Evangelical Theological Society, a member of the Translation Oversight Committee for the English Standard Version Bible, and was the general editor of the ESV Study Bible. Dr. Grudem is the author or editor of over 20 books, including the monumental 1,200-page bestseller, Systematic Theology, An Introduction to Biblical Doctrine, which has sold over 400,000 copies since it was first published in 1994. Professors, welcome to the Heritage Foundation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim Roberts, very much, and thank you for all your work in arranging this meeting. We're certainly glad to be here, and we, Barry and I, want to thank all of you for whatever contributions you have made to this Index of Economic Freedom. I keep reminding my colleague Barry Asmus that we are Christians, and our most important book is supposed to be the Bible, but he carries that Index of Economic Freedom around with him very, very often, and it's a close second, I think. There is only one effective solution to world poverty. It is the only solution that has ever worked or will ever work. It is evident from the history of every wealthy nation today. And here I speak as a professor of theology and biblical studies. I believe that the solution we are proposing is consistent with the teachings of the Bible about prosperity, productivity, property, government, and personal moral values. I should say at the outset that you may think it strange that a theology professor would speak about economics, but I remind you this is not entirely without precedent. Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, was a professor of moral philosophy, and in 1759 he published The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 17 years before his publication of The Wealth of Nations. My personal interest in this topic is, I say honestly, motivated by the teaching of the Bible. For example, Psalm 41:1, "Blessed is the one who considers the poor. In the day of trouble, the Lord delivers him." This and many other verses, I believe, tell us that God is pleased when we care for the poor. But our hope for this new book is that people will care for the poor intelligently, not out of ignorance. The book is called, as Jim mentioned, The Poverty of Nations, A Sustainable Solution. The book is aimed at this question, not how can we help individual poor people or poor communities, where much work is already being done, much good work, but rather how can we help individual nations that are poor. The book addresses the level of the nation because wealth and poverty are determined primarily at the level of the nation. If I meet you and you're an average person, you tell me you're from Bangladesh or Zimbabwe, I expect you're poor. But if you say you're from Norway or Switzerland, I expect you're quite wealthy. Why is that? It's because largely poverty or wealth are determined at the level of the nation as a whole. Barry Asmus and I are not aware of any previous book in all our reading. We're not aware of any previous book that addresses the level of poverty, it addresses the question of poverty at the level of the entire nation and does so from an explicitly Christian perspective, which we do. Now imagine for a minute that you're an influential person in a poor country in the world, and the cover of our book has per capita income colored by a color code. So the green nations are wealthy, blue are middle income, red are poor, such as India, and dark red are very poor, such as Pakistan, Haiti, or much of Central Africa. Imagine that you're an influential leader in one of these poor countries, and maybe you're a government official, maybe you're a professor at the university, maybe you're a pastor or a priest. You want help to help your nation to escape from poverty, but you aren't really sure what will work. And the advice you hear is conflicting and sometimes contradictory. You are told you need to get more foreign aid from other countries. You need to lobby for debt forgiveness. You need to discover more natural resources. No, you need to redistribute income from rich to poor in your country. No, you need to print more money. No, you need to blame colonialism. Well, you really should promote free trade coffee. And so there are confusing signals being given. Our counsel for you, if you are in a poor country and you have influence in that country, our counsel is to focus on two economic factors. First, per capita income. This is the standard measure of whether a country is rich or poor. Haiti, $1,300 per capita income. Uganda, average of $1,400 per person per year. Pakistan, $2,900. These are dark red on the map. They're poor countries. The question is, how can you move from there to being a low middle income country such as India, $3,900, poor but improving, to a high middle income country, China, Gary, if you believe the numbers, which we talked about earlier this morning, and or Mexico, $15,000 per capita income. How can you move from being low to low middle to high middle income to a high per capita income country such as Japan, $36,000, Germany, $39,000, or the United States, approximately $50,000 per capita income? Now, we agree that per capita income doesn't tell us everything about a nation. It doesn't tell us about the distribution of income. Saudi Arabia is green on the map because it has a high per capita income, but it masks the fact that, or it doesn't reveal to us that the distribution is horrible because most all of the wealth is oil wealth held in the hands of a few members of the royal family, and most of the population is trapped in poverty. But per capita income is still very important because as long as per capita income remains low, your country will remain poor. The second concept we want you to focus on as a leader in a poor country is gross domestic product. This is, of course, the standard measure of what a country produces. It's the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. The size of a nation's GDP, gross domestic product, is the main factor that determines its wealth or poverty. Now, just to take a very simple example in very round numbers, you have you take the country of Honduras, which I use because I can get some round numbers from it. 8 million people in Honduras, $36 billion gross domestic product. Divide 8 million into 36 billion, and you get $4,500 per capita income in Honduras. Now, imagine for a minute that Honduras could double its GDP. Imagine that it could move from $36 billion GDP to $72 billion. Divide 8 into 72 billion, 8 million into 72 billion, you get $9,000 per capita income. Suddenly, Honduras has moved up to be a middle-income country similar to Mexico. So the focus of your efforts as a leader in a poor nation, the focus of your efforts must be to increase the production of goods and services in your nation and therefore increase GDP. That is the only goal that will bring a country out of poverty. The most important question then is, what will increase a country's GDP? Our book attempts to answer this by discussing 79 factors that will lead to wealth or, when neglected, trap a nation in poverty. And those 79 factors fall in three categories. The economic system, which Dr. Asmus is going to talk about, and the economic system we're recommending is free market. The governmental policies, and I'll talk about some of those. The heart of those is government that cares for and serves the people rather than the government leaders. And the cultural beliefs and values in a country, and we list 35 of them. So those are the three areas that those 79 factors fall in. Before I talk about some of those factors, and And I could say, thank you, Jim, you should have all gotten a handout with a list of those 79 factors. And if you don't have one, perhaps you hold up a hand and could someone, just keep your hand in the air until one comes. We say in our book that focusing on increasing GDP is the only solution, and that we have to be aware that others have suggested some wrong goals. For instance, more aid is not the right goal. No nation has ever escaped poverty by means of foreign aid. Foreign aid given through the governments of poor countries usually does more harm than good, because it entrenches corrupt rulers in power, it fattens their personal bank accounts, and foments civil wars over control of the nation's treasury and all the aid money. Economists such as William Easterly, Paul Collier, Dambisa Moyo, and others have written about the harmful results of foreign aid. From my perspective as a Christian theologian, the Bible supports the idea that nations must produce their own prosperity. When the people of Israel came into the promised land, God did not promise them perennial donations of riches from other nations. Rather, he promised them that they would have access to hills filled with copper and iron, which they would have to dig out and refine, and fields of vines and fig trees, which they would have to tend and harvest each year. God's blessing of prosperity would come by productive work, according to Deuteronomy 8, 7-10. Interestingly also, the manna from heaven that God gave them in the wilderness ceased the day after they ate from the first harvest in the promised land. And even the poor in Israel had to work for what they got by gathering the gleanings that were left at the edges of the fields, Leviticus 19, 9-10. There is no thought in the Bible that poor people or poor nations were to become dependent on donations from others year after year. To repeat, no nation has ever escaped from poverty by means of foreign aid. Now the question comes up, well, does it do any good to send gifts of food and medical help and other things to poor countries? Our response is, Barry and I have actually contributed to some of that work, and there are agencies that do some work of sending food and medical help. These charitable gifts of things like food and medical care are important today because they often meet urgent needs. But remember, they are addressing the symptoms, hunger and sickness, rather than the cause. The poor nation is not producing enough of its own food and its own medical care. And there is a danger that such aid can create dependency. Second thing that's a wrong goal is debt forgiveness. Debt forgiveness, forgiving a poor nation's debts, is not the answer because it is just more foreign aid carried out in a two-step process. First the loan, then its cancellation. Third, natural resources. Will it solve the poverty of a nation to discover and extract more natural resources? This can be of some help, as in Norway it's been used wisely, but too often more natural resources lead to civil wars to gain control of the government and thus control of the immense money that comes from oil or minerals. It's not the answer to poverty because many African and Latin American countries have immense resources, but they remain poor, while nations such as Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore all lack significant resources, but they have become wealthy by creating productive economies. They've produced their own prosperity. Fourth, transferring goods from one person to another does not increase GDP. If a man who has 2 shirts gives to a man who has none, that's a good deed and comports with Luke 3:11 in the Bible. But it does not increase GDP. The nation's GDP remains exactly the same before the shirt was given from one man to another. Fifth, printing money does not increase GDP because money itself is not a product of value. People cannot eat money or wear it or ride it or drive on it or plant it or put it over their heads to protect them from the rain. They can use money to buy other things but because it's a medium of exchange, but it's not a product of value in itself. So printing money doesn't increase GDP. Sixth, blaming poverty on other factors on outside factors does not increase GDP. There's a tendency to blame poverty on colonialism, on the world economic system, on world market prices for goods, on multinational corporations, or on rich nations. And I could say, from a perspective of a Christian, we have the experience in our own church of sending high school or college students for a summer mission trip to a poor country, and they come back and their immediate response is, we have too much money, it's our fault that these poor nations are poor. An analysis of factors such as colonialism, world economic system, market prices for goods, and things like that is complex. It's in our book. But the main point we want to make is that's not the question. Who are you going to blame? The question is, what can you do now looking forward? The goal must be to continually increase your GDP, to produce more goods and services of value. Has this ever happened? Yes, it's the only way that any nation has ever come out of poverty. There were no wealthy nations. The whole map was dark red 250 years ago. Then beginning in the late 1700s with the Industrial Revolution, some nations began to produce more, much more. Began with Britain as the leader, producing textiles, especially cotton, far faster, cheaper, and better than anyone in the world. Many other manufactured products followed, and soon other nations in Europe and North America began to produce their own prosperity. Same pattern has continued in the modern era. Japan was a poor agricultural economy in the early 1900s, but it became the world's second largest economy in the late 20th century by manufacturing cars, computers, TVs, and other things. South Korea went from being one of the world's poorest nations in the 1950s to the 12th richest nation today by manufacturing products like TVs, cars, and microwaves. Chile, as we talked about earlier this morning, began to move out of poverty in the 1970s by growing abundant fruits and vegetables to export. I think most of the apples I eat now come from Chile. And China, of course, by many small manufactured goods. But the story is the same throughout history. Every nation that has moved out of poverty has done so by producing its own prosperity. Speaking as a Christian professor of theology again, it seems to me that producing prosperity, creating wealth, is not moral evil, should not be called materialism, and it's not morally neutral, but it's a morally positive activity. It's something that God intended for Adam and Eve and the human race when he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and told them to subdue the earth. And that Hebrew word radaf means to make the resources of the earth profitable for your own benefit. I think that this ability to create products of value from the earth is unique to the human race. It's not found in the animal kingdom. And I think it's an imitation of God's own creative activity and honors him, showing that we are created in his image. What do I mean by creating products of value from the resources of the earth? I went into a shop near my home recently, and there was a man who had these little pieces of plastic, looked like a tiny ashtray. I might give you 5 cents for it. I don't think it's worth very much by itself. But he put it in a machine, and soon came these glasses lenses, costing over $100 per lens. All of a sudden, a little bitty piece of plastic worth maybe 5 cents costs over $100. He increased the GDP of the country by $100 per lens. That's creating products of value. Now, we focus on 79 factors within nations which will enable that kind of productivity to increase. I want to look at a few. First, the first area we look at is the economic system. And we are arguing that only a free market system will ever bring a nation from poverty to prosperity. Barry is going to talk about factors in a free market system, but I want to also mention that we have chapter 6 in this book listing the moral advantages of a free market system as opposed to any other economic system. A free market system promotes freedom of choice for moral actions, because if the government takes all my money from me and spends it for me, I don't have any morally significant choice in how that money is spent. But if I am allowed to keep it myself, then I'm accountable and I can make morally good or wrong decisions on how to spend that money. A free market best promotes freedom of choice for moral actions. It promotes personal integrity and truth-telling. I won't return to the grocer who lies to me about the freshness of the bread or the milk. I'll go to another grocer. So it's the advantage of the merchant to tell the truth. It promotes personal accountability. Had window repair done at my house a month ago, and some part of it wasn't caulked correctly. I called the company and they came back, and the man who put it in wrongly was accountable because he wanted to fix it, because the merchant wanted to have my recommendation for other customers. The free market promotes personal accountability. It moderates selfishness and greed and uses them for good. It promotes personal charity, and levels of charitable giving in free market economies are very significant. A free market economy best meets the needs of others and the wants of others because there's an economic reward in making products that are of value to others. A free market economy truly helps the poor As we've said, it's the only system that has brought nations out of poverty to prosperity. To the objection that people say a free market economy depends on greed, we respond, no, it depends on self-interest. And self-interest is not morally wrong. Self-interest is evident every time we eat breakfast or take a breath, or we'll look both ways before we cross the street. Promoting self-interest is not a moral evil, but something good in biblical teaching, in my understanding. And as far as greed, a free market moderates greed and both rebukes it, because you won't go often to a business where you sense the man is excessively greedy who's selling you a product, but also people who have excessive greed will often turn that into a tremendous drive to produce products of value for other people. So there are moral benefits to the free market system. We go into some detail. The government of the system, we list 38 factors characteristic of a good government. I'll mention some. One is the rule of law. All people are equally accountable to the laws. The great example of this in the Bible is the story of David and Bathsheba. At the height of David's power as king, he committed adultery with Bathsheba and was rebuked by the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 11, showing that even the king was not above the law in Israel. Number two, a fair court system where courts show no favoritism or bias but enforce justice impartially. Three, absence of bribery and corruption. We list several important freedoms the government must protect. Freedom to travel and transport goods anywhere within the nation. Robert Guest, editor at The Economist, tells the story of being a passenger on a beer delivery truck in Cameroon, where they started out with 30,000 bottles of Guinness beer, and they were going to an inland city that should have taken them 1.5 days to arrive at. It was only 300 miles. With modern roads, of course, it would have only taken about 5 or 6 hours, but it should have taken them 1.5 days. Instead, it took 4 days. They were stopped 47 times at checkpoints where individual extortionists with a gun required a fine before they could go on. This is the absence of the rule of law, but it means there's an absence of freedom to travel and transport goods and to buy and sell in the nation. And every product is subject to that, and everybody pays a price. Other freedoms we list, I won't go into them. The values of the system, we list 35 cultural values and beliefs. Belief in God, who holds people accountable. Believe that he approves several character traits related to work and productivity, such as literacy, pursuing one's job as a calling from God, being honest and diligent as work because one is working for the Lord and not men, being thrifty in time and money, which is a stewardship from God. The society values and honors truthfulness. Society respects private ownership of property. Society believes that the earth is here for the use and benefit of human beings. Society believes that the purpose of government is to serve the nation and bring benefit to the people as a whole, not just the ruler and his friends. I'm going to close with two final values that we mention. Barry Asmus and I do not believe that material prosperity is the most important issue in the world. For Jesus taught that love for God and love for neighbor are the two greatest commandments in Matthew 22. And so our next to the last value is the society counts family, friends, and joy in life as more important than material wealth. And we say that many poor countries already are strong in that area, and that should be retained. And number 35, the society counts spiritual well-being and a relationship to God as more important than material wealth. So love for family and friends and love for God and a relationship with God are more important than material prosperity. And we must not neglect those. But if we are talking about how to solve world poverty, the solution can only come through increased economic productivity within the poor nations themselves. Now the question comes up, who can change these cultural beliefs which will lead to changes in the government system and changes in the economic system? Our answer is everybody who has roles of influence in the poor nation. Pastors, we believe, are very important here because they have vast influence in many poor countries, priests and rabbis and other religious leaders similarly. Also, teachers, literature and media that are read and watched in the culture, government officials to some degree, we're appealing to heroic leaders in poor countries to take steps to bring about these changes. Conclusion, there is only one effective solution to world poverty. Nations must produce their own prosperity. The good news is that many are already doing this. The even better news is that all poor nations are able to do this. But tragically today, millions of poor people around the world remain trapped in lifelong poverty. Not because people in other nations are rich, but because the poor nations in which they live are living under oppression. They are oppressed by economic systems that cannot bring prosperity except for a tiny despotic elite. They are oppressed by laws and governments that cannot bring prosperity except for a tiny group of privileged rulers. And they are oppressed by dominant cultural beliefs and values that perpetuate poverty and cannot produce prosperity. It is time to set them free.
Well, it's great being at Heritage. It seems like I have been carrying this book for the last 15 years around the world, and so it is. It's always been under my arm. I'm so thankful for what Heritage has done. I have to say that if I'm asked what are the two words that could make a difference, those two words would be economic freedom, freedom to choose, freedom to invest, freedom to save, freedom to hire, freedom to fire, freedom to own, that's a huge one, operate, etc. So the economic freedoms are absolutely critical in making all this happen. Freedom really is the mainspring of economic prosperity. Freedom really is a virus for which there is no antidote. Freedom really is a country's best investment. More freedom, more bread, more freedom, more per capita income. Drop into Berlin 30 years ago, West Berlin, vibrant with economic activity. Go through Checkpoint Charlie, guns, dogs, moats. You're now in East Berlin. It's like a different country, gray, drab, not many goods on the shelves, not many cars on the streets, just a few hundred yards back over. Wow, West Berlin. Wait, this is all one city. These are all Germans. This is the best economic test with controllable variables that you could ever imagine. Why such a marked contrast between East Berlin and West Berlin? West Berlin has economic freedom. North Korea, South Korea, the same way. All Koreans, a line draws it. South Korea, lots of economic freedom. North Korea, not any economic freedom at all. South Korea, living 10 to 20 times per capita basis better than North Korea. And then how do you even measure what it's like to live in an economic prison? So thank you, Heritage Foundation, for doing this book, The Index of Economic Freedom. It's just such a wonderful reference book. It's a way to look at 160 or 70 or 80 countries, pick it up very quickly what they've done, where they are on a per capita basis, what's their population, what are their main resources. You flip the page, you see the 10 economic freedoms that they measure as similarly as they can, year after year after year. So it is truly, truly a wonderful book. Well, after economic freedom, obviously coming out of economic freedom, free markets. Nations throughout the world have tried everything. I not heard Wayne kind of say that as he did before, but it wasn't long ago that every nation was red. It wasn't long ago that all through history, from the beginning of time, $2 or $3 of annual per capita income for hundreds, thousands of years. No bend in the line, no bend in the line. And finally, a little bit of bend in the 17th century, 18th and 19th, and then the 20th, an extreme bend in an upward direction. Wow. Why? As nation after nation learns that freedom is the mainspring, as they learn that free markets, allowing people freedom to choose, free markets, the market is a miraculous instrument of communication. The free market is a stupendous transmitter of ideas while determining value. The free market is like a galactic bathroom scale where supply and demand of millions and billions, determining price, wages, interest rates, profits, and losses, and all transmitted down to you and I sitting across from a table from each other. We're ready to do a volunteer exchange. And my question to you is, how much? And you say, how much? Well, what about this? And all of a sudden, we enter a mutually gained volunteer exchange, and we increase wealth. So it's one of the most magnificent. My libertarian friends just explain it as it's spontaneous, it's a miracle, the market. A Christian would say, no, property has been with human beings from day one. So it's property that created capitalism, not capitalism that has created property. But maybe that's just a nuance, but when we talk about this system, I mean, it becomes absolutely critical that government understand how important private ownership is, how important the market is. Hey, listen. The poor people of this world have some housing, but they don't have a title to that housing. The poor people of this world grow some crops, but they don't have a deed to those crops. The poor people of this world run some small little businesses, but they don't have articles of incorporation. Here's the problem. Without having a proper property document, you can't get collateralized. Without a proper document, there's no way that you have any way to securitize borrowing $50, $100. They're not going to loan it to you because you're not collateralized. The world needs property documents. Government, that should be your main responsibility. As important as economic freedom is, and I just love it, but let's make sure that one of the main aspects of this is ownership and a proper document by which you can collateralize. It is critical. If you're going to do that, then the poor people of this world obviously need verifiable addresses. We are so fortunate in the United States that Thomas Jefferson in 1785, just 9 years after the Declaration of Independence, says, we are going to survey this nation. We're going to start at a place called East Oberlin, Ohio. We're to anchor it there with north, south, east, west coordinates, and we're going to spread that out, and we're going to know exactly where everything is and survey this country so everybody will have a verifiable address. And all you have to do, and so they did it mile by mile. I spent more time looking out of the window yesterday, flying from Phoenix to Washington, D.C., to see, indeed, I mean, this whole country, mile squares, there it is. It's just beautiful to watch, to look. And that was all done for us a long time ago. So from the beginning, all you had to do is go into New York City, and you could buy some acreage. There it is, 640 acres per mile by mile, or half of that, 320, blah, blah, blah. So there it all is, for $1 an acre. And then as time went on, my grandparents, who came from Russia to Ellis Island at the turn of the century, they landed in Flint, Michigan, and why are we here? Well, you said you were farmers. Yeah, but we're not dairy farmers. So, well, what are you? Well, we're sugar beet farmers. So they put on a train, and my grandma and grandpa are 16 years old, landed in Denver, Colorado, got out of the train with a knapsack, and started making their way along the Platte River, and they wandered for 80 miles from Denver, down the river, and then they worked their way off the Platte River and said, how about this place? And my grandma says, that's perfect. There's a little town there. It's called Hillrose. About 50 people. Grandpa says, too crowded. So they went out a little further. But the point is, then they could go and get property. At that time, it cost them $2 or $3 an acre. A local jury determined the price of that property, and wham! The next thing you know, they could put up a fence, and they could build a pig pen, and then they could build a little shack that they lived in. And all of a sudden, and so people can't even speak English. My grandpa ends up owning 6 farms and did very well. give people a chance, give people economic freedom. But the main job of government was to give grandpa a title and a deed and a verifiable address. The poor people of this world do not have that, and they need that. So we are so very, very fortunate. The other good economics is really going to come out of. They just don't need an economist to talk to them about specialization, an economist to talk about them about comparative advantage, an economist to tell you about free trade. Yes, yes. If they want to listen, listen. Yes, free trade is wonderful. Yes, free trade does expand the pool that you get to fish in. Yes, yes, free trade really is like a perpetual motion machine. Free trade, it's bigger. And now you and I do a mutual gains from voluntary exchange, and we increase income. Income will only increase more trade, more income, more. So it's a motion machine. They will figure that out. People do not. Paternalism does not work. They don't need someone telling them how to do this. They'll figure out that specialization. Adam Smith figured it out in 1776 in his pin factory. I mean, 10 people could each make 1 or 2 or 5 pins per day. But if they specialized in the 18 categories of making a pin, then they could produce tens of thousands of pins. People will figure that out. Specialization. They'll figure it out. Trade. And of course, this wonderful thing called the market, infused in this market, is the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is critical. The entrepreneur takes the chances, takes the risk, finds opportunities, blah, blah, blah. But again, you don't have to sit down. You don't have to sit and create the factory for them. You ought to make baskets and you ought to sell them. They will figure it out. They're smart people. As you think of the human being, for heaven's sake, created in the image of God, the wealth of a nation is its people, it's their creativity and their ideas. And give them a chance, give them economic freedom, give them ownership, give them title. Government, do the things that you can and only you can do. Give them, and you'll watch specialization, you'll watch trade, you'll watch entrepreneurship, and you will therefore watch wealth production. I'm done. There it is. Thank you. No. I'll do it.
You want any more?
No.
Okay.
We wanted to leave time for Q&A.
Well, and that's good. I think you probably have stimulated a few questions.
Well, that's the whole idea.
I'm going to give first dibs, though, to those high school students in Tyler, Texas, watching us. And read a question by email from Roy Maynard, editorial page of the Tyler Morning Telegram. What policies can the U.S. adopt to encourage the rule of law in other countries, say Cuba or Venezuela or Haiti? Sanctions have failed to influence their institutions.
That's so cute. I love that. Because every time Wayne and I, we've done some lectures in a lot of countries throughout the world.
Make sure you speak into a mic.
Speak into a mic. Start again, Barry.
It seems like the first question is coming back to the United States. What can the United States do, or what is the United States? We so much always want to get it back. When we wrote our book, we said we're just not going to do an altar call for the United States. It's going to be principles that are going to work throughout the world. And so every country is absolutely different. I have to tell you, if you're in Haiti, you can ask the Haitians, is there any possibility at all that you are going to get out of poverty if you continue to practice voodooism? If you think so, great, practice voodoo till you're blue in the face. I'm not going to change that, but I will mention to you that voodooism is very progress resistant. There are a number of religions that are progress resistant rather than progress prone. So, every country is different. There, if somehow they could have something affecting their culture in a different way than voodooism, they have a chance for prosperity.
Yeah, I could say, too, that when Barry and I talk to various audiences, all of a sudden people are seeing parallels to the United States. So we just say at the outset, we're not going to talk about the United States. We're not going to talk about United States economic policy, United States political policy. It's not the purpose of our book. We're talking about poor countries. So if you have any questions that have to do with poor countries, that would be good. We do say here, we do quote Paul Collier to say there are some limited impacts, limited policy changes that rich countries can make. He says some targeted use of foreign aid. We have some doubts. Military intervention to maintain peace after conflicts. Adoption of laws to help prosecute criminals who steal money and deposit it in wealthy nations, and trade policies which lower trade barriers, which Barry is just all about. So yes, those things, but the major change has to come within the poor country itself.
Okay, what other questions do we have today? We have somebody with a microphone. Alex Schaffwin from the Atlas Economic Research Foundation.
Again, thank you, Barry and Wayne, for the important effort that you have done. You mentioned, Barry, that private property was first. And when I was studying, the authors and anthropologists that Alan Smith quotes, those anthropologists argued that it was the family that came first. And actually, private property was instituted to protect and make possible the intergenerational family. So my question is, have you encountered other authors who explain or describe that same process or anything about the importance of the family as an institution for the richness and the wealth of nations?
Both are very important. The family is, of course, is the basic institution of society. So we do not mean to diminish that. And I don't think we talked about, oh yes, we do talk about maintenance of stable family structures and laws that increase, give incentives to maintenance of stable family structures within the book as one of the governmental policies that can help. So I don't have enough knowledge about the early history of mankind to know what happened in various countries about property and families. I do know the early history of the Bible, where the family was first. It was Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They had children, and eventually property rights developed. So from that standpoint, from a Bible standpoint, I guess I would agree with you.
Okay, we'll take Sam, and then maybe we could take two or three questions, and then please identify yourself. Sam?
Boy, I loved the story about taking the beer across Cameroon, having driven from Rwanda up to the northern part of DRC.
Mm-hmm.
I paid for road insurance, car insurance, 36 times.
At the point of a gun?
At the point of a gun. And then on the way home, rather than the point of the gun was shooting at us.
Wow.
And so that's a really good point. And so my question is, how do you get the gun? How does a nation get the gun out of the hand of that person and put a plowshare in it?
Mm-hmm.
Could you identify yourself too?
My name is
your
Sam.
affiliation?
My name is Sam Casey. I'm the general counsel of the Jubilee Campaign, and one of our projects is in Uganda, trying to get people to get property documents in northern Uganda after their civil war.
And let's take one more question. We can then maybe just do a couple. To answer a couple kind of stacked up. So.
That's fine.
Sure. My name is Ben Stovall. I'm an intern here at Heritage, and my question might actually be able to go hand in hand with that a little bit. Along those lines, it has to do with government interventions. In your short excerpt that you just read to us, you mentioned that the military should only be involved in other countries to maintain peace after a conflict. But then, in an instance like this, we see countries where their internal policies are impacting us economically. So at what point does that impact have enough effect that we need to get involved and make a difference on a separate country's internal?
Okay. I'm going to say in answer to both of those questions, there's a lot we don't know. And our basic answer to solving poverty in poor nations is that's something that people within the poor nations have to do themselves. We can do things that have a little bit of influence, but ultimately you need people to rise up and institute the rule of law. There were checkpoints like that in Germany until the mid-1830s. But all of a sudden the country decided to institute rule of law, and people couldn't extort that kind of money anymore. I don't know how it... Basically, we were in Albania, for instance. How do you overcome bribery in Albania? How do you overcome the corrupt court system in Albania? People are asking, how do you do this? We don't know. It's not Paul Collier. Who's the other? Easterly. It's Easterly or Collier says local knowledge is how it's going to happen. And what we're hoping to do is to inform audiences in the United States and hopefully inform those whom they talk to in other countries and say, this is what has to be done. We don't know how to do it, but you have to figure that out, and we think you can.
It was kind of a bait and switch. The book's on poverty, for sure. And that is why a typical person throughout the world, especially a Christian, would pick it up. They're very, very interested in poverty. They are not going to pick up a book that's talking about free market economics. They're just not going to do it. First of all,
Not pastors, for instance.
well, yeah, uh-huh. So the interesting thing about this book is pastors are telling us, gosh, I didn't know that. I thought that capitalism is greed, and that's all it's been. You can't base a system on greed, and they find out, wow, enlightened self-interest, a little bit different concept, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the biggest push is to help the world that wouldn't necessarily read anything about free markets and limited government and voluntary exchange, et cetera, are going to get a great economic tutorial, we hope. But it's still it's your hands. You figure it out. If you think hunt and gathering, if you think subsistence farming, if you think socialism, communism, feudalism, mercantilism is the way, do it. We think history shows that doesn't work. That the only system that does work is free market, and we make that so plain that just comes and smacks them in the face. Oh, come on, be a little loose about that. Can't you have these other kinds of systems? You can try it. Don't seem to work very well.
So our conviction is step number one is clear thinking about what will solve poverty, and implementation has to be done within the poor country. Okay.
Did you have a follow-up?
The poverty of nations, these are, I'm talking maybe to the pastor, we think of books like Hole in Your Gospel and other things like
Yep.
this. Is the poverty of nations required for the wealth of nations?
No.
Can all of these nations become wealthy,
Yes.
and we can and we can sustain the earth?
Yes. Many times over.
And does your book talk about that?
Yes.
End of question.
Julian
To
Simon,
Charlotte.
Bjorn Lomborg. Yeah.
Hi, Charlotte Florence of the Heritage Foundation. Cover Africa, Middle East policy here. I'm interested to see your perspectives on technology and how it can either speed up some of these processes, such as e-governance or some of the property mapping that's going on in Nigeria right now, versus how technology can be used, I think, as ways to hinder some of these processes. I think most recent election in Zimbabwe, some issues in Kenya where e-governance has been used to cover up some things. So do you see that as a catalyst to speed these processes up, or is it something it just needs to be built into it? How do you see that working?
Both.
Yeah, both, but more on the positive side.
Yeah. Well, yes. Good.
Admittedly, advantage to the United States. I mean, in the sense of they're going to learn so much that comes. Software is going to drive the knowledge economic world. There's no question about it. And cloud computing and flat top computers and 3D printing and all the technology, biotech and bioengineering and robotics and nanotechnology and blah, 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 mainly comes out of a fabulous software being developed over here. Here's the neat thing, is we're in just a few years, 5 billion people. 5 billion? I mean, is that exciting? And so we are moving to, let's just put it this way. We closed out the 20th century with at least 40% of the world being in poverty, defined as $2 or $3 a day. We will close out the 21st century with a whole bunch of countries flipping into green. Most of them. It's going to be because they have access to information. Now, poor fishermen, what do I do with this catch of tuna? Clicks it in and says, we'll be waiting. Just like Wayne, you call a cab now, you just call a cab and he gives you his name and there he is. Now the guy that's going to buy the fish. So I think the technology is going to be incredibly helpful to poor nations throughout the world.
Good, Barry.
You
Thank you.
agree?
I agree.
Okay.
You convinced
Time
me.
for maybe one last set of questions, if we could just get the mic to these people.
I'm sorry, I'm not a great speaker, but what do you think of Bolivia being a small country and expelling U.S. aid?
Okay.
Any thoughts on it?
And could you identify yourself, please? And
Oh, my name's Erica Garcia, and I'm just basically very
It's
interested in
red
the
on the map.
Bolivian.
On the
yeah.
South
Okay.
American map.
And then another question over here.
Oh, yeah, okay, we can't answer yet.
Yeah, we'll just do one last question.
I assume you speak a lot to Christian audiences.
Yep.
And I was curious as to what you perceive the attitude is among Christians to free markets. I know there is a Christian left
Yep.
that's pretty anti-free market. I'm wondering what
Right.
you're seeing out there in Christian colleges and seminaries.
Yeah.
Could you identify yourself too,
Oh,
please?
Mark Clausen, Cedarville University.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. And was there any, one last
There was
question?
one
or-
more in the back.
Okay, one last one in the back, yeah. If you could just do the mic, yeah, thanks. And identify yourself, please.
Yeah, Thomas Ford, I'm an international economist. I worked at the World Bank for about 10 years, and I did land reform and land tendering and so forth. But starting back at Wayne's first comment of saying it's about the nation, one thing that I noticed that's very interesting when they compare support to other nations, it's always talked about the governments giving to other nations. Whereas I think the U.S. is unique because of the broad amount of, at the base level, given the
Right.
aid instead of the government given the aid, and I think that's a wrong index of comparison across nations. And then secondly, I gave Robert some information. There's a great podcast and a thing over at the Wilson Center yesterday about I was in Afghanistan, but this is about Iraq. This goes back to the security issue. There's a good talk about how can you move forward without security, and as we saw in Iraq, as soon as we pulled out, everything went backwards.
Yep.
Okay, so with these last three questions.
I want to talk about the response from Christian groups, first of all. The major response we have been getting is this: wow, I never understood this before. That's the primary, whoa, you put it all together, increase GDP, and this is how you do it. Now I see. And all of a sudden, everything falls into that category. So we've had a very positive, we haven't had any pushback, maybe one review on Amazon.com out of 19 positive ones. But we haven't had any negative pushback yet, so we've been encouraged. What's your name?
Mark Clausen.
I could say we talked about capitalism for a year or two or three, and especially in European settings, we got such an intense pushback from people thinking capitalism is just evil, irredeemable, etc. We decided not to use the word capitalism in our book. We use instead free market. And the reason is the essence of what we're talking about is not capital. The essence of it is human freedom to make individual economic decisions about what is bought and what is produced and what is sold. And so why use a term that was hurled at us by Karl Marx as a pejorative term rather than a term that has positive connotations and gets the essence of what the market system is about, freedom. So we use free market. Now we say in here we appreciate the many defenses of capitalism that have been made, Michael Novak and many others. So we're thankful for that, and we understand it in the positive sense and like it. But we decided as a strategic issue, let's use free market. So I don't know what to do about Bolivia. It's red, it's Marxist, it's intense poverty, and I don't like kicking people out. So.
Well, USAID was there, along with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Morales government has kicked a lot of the U.S. government agencies out.
I do not
yeah.
know any details.
Yeah.
It's just surprising throughout the world how many people do not know because they either have not heard or they don't understand. We've even met a prime minister who hadn't heard that, no, Prime Minister, you don't have to sell your beaches there in Albania. You can, there'll be hotel chains that would love to lease it for 30 to 50 years and create economic activity. And subsequent to coming from there, then he said he's trying to make some contacts with some people who create some growth. Didn't know, didn't understand, didn't realize, and it just seems to turn the lights on. And capitalism has been almost worldwide rejected, certainly by the Christian community. The Christian doesn't want anything to do. They couldn't be more misinformed. It's just tragic. So we're going to make another shot at it.
Okay, good. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. Well, I would assume that your question about Iraq would be, the deteriorating security situation in Iraq would be that at the end of the day, it's up to the Iraqi people to decide.
Yes, but, well, I'm with you. I mean, I think we've lost many of the gains we had there, and they needed help to protect from terrorism for a number of years to come. And we would have had a stable, functioning democracy there. But
If there'd been a
continued-
residual U.S. troop presence.
Exactly,
Yep.
as in South Korea, as in Germany.
Yep,
so.
okay. Well, Professors Grudem and Asmus have graciously agreed to stay after our event, probably here at the podium this morning, to autograph copies of their book, which is available for sale in the lobby. Gentlemen, this has been an excellent and enriching discussion about an important topic. I hope that we can welcome you at Heritage again in the future. But for now, please join me in thanking our speakers.